Throughout modern history, periods of deep economic instability have often coincided with heightened foreign tensions. When inflation rises, wages stagnate, unemployment spreads, and inequality becomes impossible to ignore, political leadership faces growing public dissatisfaction. In such moments, shifting attention outward can become a powerful strategy. By emphasizing external threats, governments can redirect frustration away from domestic economic structures and toward foreign adversaries. The narrative changes from "why is the economy failing ordinary people" to "how do we defend ourselves against danger." This redirection reshapes public debate and reframes accountability. In times of economic strain, working families feel the pressure first. Rising food prices, housing insecurity, debt burdens, and limited job opportunities generate anxiety and anger. These conditions naturally lead citizens to question policies, corporate power, and wealth concentration. However, when geopolitical conflict dominates headlines, economic grievances can fade from center stage. Media coverage shifts to military analysis, national security briefings, and patriotic messaging. The emotional intensity of external conflict often overrides sustained discussion about structural inequality or economic reform. Military escalation can also generate a temporary sense of unity. Political divisions that revolve around taxation, labor rights, healthcare access, or corporate regulation may be overshadowed by calls for national solidarity. Citizens who were previously critical of economic policy may hesitate to voice dissent during moments framed as national emergencies. Leaders can position themselves as protectors rather than policymakers, strengthening their authority while limiting scrutiny of economic decisions. Defense spending further reinforces this dynamic. Expanding military budgets is frequently justified as necessary for security, even when social programs face cuts due to budget constraints. This creates a paradox. Resources appear scarce when addressing poverty, education, or healthcare, yet abundant when funding weapons systems and military operations. The framing of security priorities allows economic debates to shift away from redistribution or reform and toward defense contracts and strategic positioning. Meanwhile, corporations tied to defense industries often experience financial gains, influencing political incentives to sustain heightened tensions. The financial markets also respond differently to conflict than to social spending. Military contracts can stimulate certain sectors, creating the appearance of economic momentum. Political leaders may highlight stock market resilience or industrial output tied to defense manufacturing as evidence of strength. This narrative can temporarily mask deeper economic imbalances, including wage stagnation or rising household debt. Public discourse becomes dominated by strategic maps and military readiness rather than labor conditions or wealth concentration. Fear plays a central role in sustaining this shift. External threats trigger emotional reactions that can overshadow complex economic debates. Security concerns are often presented as urgent and immediate, while economic restructuring appears gradual and contested. As a result, political energy moves toward defense policy instead of systemic economic change. Public attention becomes absorbed by questions of confrontation, retaliation, and deterrence, leaving less space for examining corporate influence, fiscal priorities, or income distribution. A military attack on Iran by Israel and the United States would not remain confined to a battlefield. In today's interconnected global economy, Regional conflicts rapidly translate into worldwide economic disruption. Iran occupies a strategically critical position in global energy markets, particularly because of its proximity to the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes. Any military escalation in this region would immediately raise fears of supply interruptions, insurance risks for shipping, and potential blockades, all of which would push oil prices sharply upward. Oil remains a foundational input in the global economy. When oil prices surge, transportation costs increase almost instantly. Airlines, shipping companies, and trucking industries face higher fuel expenses, which are then passed on to consumers. The cost of moving goods across borders rises, affecting everything from food imports to manufacturing components. Supermarket prices climb, utility bills increase. The inflationary pressure spreads beyond energy and begins affecting nearly every sector of economic life. For households already struggling with tight budgets, even small price increases can have destabilizing effects. Financial markets would react swiftly to the uncertainty. Investors typically respond to geopolitical instability by shifting capital into perceived safe haven assets, such as gold or stable government bonds. Stock markets often experience volatility as traders anticipate disruptions in trade flows and energy supplies. Currency markets can fluctuate dramatically, particularly for countries heavily dependent on imported energy. Emerging economies, many of which rely on stable oil prices and foreign investment, could experience capital flight, weakening currencies, and rising borrowing costs. The consequences would extend far beyond energy importers. Countries that export oil might see temporary revenue gains from higher prices, but these gains are often accompanied by political instability and global demand slowdowns. High energy prices tend to suppress consumer spending worldwide, as households allocate more of their income toward fuel and basic necessities. When consumption declines, economic growth slows. Manufacturing sectors face reduced demand, global trade contracts, and unemployment risks rise. Debt dynamics would also intensify. Many developing nations carry significant external debt denominated in foreign currencies. If energy prices spike while currencies weaken, debt repayment becomes more expensive. Governments may be forced to cut social programs or raise taxes to manage fiscal pressures. International lending institutions could impose stricter conditions, further tightening economic constraints. The global south, already vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and climate related challenges, would bear a disproportionate share of the burden. Inflationary waves triggered by energy shocks can also complicate monetary policy decisions. Central banks may respond to rising inflation by increasing interest rates, aiming to stabilize prices. However, higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive for businesses and households. Mortgage rates climb, business investment slow, and job creation weakens. The attempt to contain inflation can inadvertently deepen economic slowdown, creating a cycle of stagflation-like pressures. Supply chains, still recovering from previous global disruptions, would face renewed strain. Industries dependent on petrochemicals, plastics, fertilizers, and industrial fuels would see production costs rise. Agricultural sectors would be affected by higher fertilizer and transportation expenses, potentially leading to food shortages in vulnerable regions. The ripple effects would touch industries far removed from the initial conflict zone, illustrating how deeply integrated modern economies have become. One of the most revealing contradictions in modern political economy is the persistent claim that governments lack sufficient funds for social investment while simultaneously expanding military budgets with remarkable speed and scale. In times of tension or conflict, vast financial resources are mobilized almost overnight for defense spending. Emergency appropriations are passed, procurement contracts are accelerated, and billions are allocated to weapons systems, logistics, intelligence, and deployment. Yet, when the conversation turns to healthcare expansion, affordable housing, public education, or poverty reduction, political leaders frequently insist that budgets are tight and fiscal discipline is necessary. This contrast exposes deeper priorities embedded within economic systems. Military spending is often framed as essential to national security and survival, positioning it beyond ordinary budget debates. Social programs, on the other hand, are commonly described as costs rather than investments. The language used shapes public perception. Defense budgets are described in terms of protection and strength, while social spending is discussed in terms of burden and affordability. The framing influences voters and limits the scope of policy imagination. The defense industry plays a significant role in reinforcing this imbalance. Large corporations that manufacture weapons, aircraft, surveillance systems, and military technology operate within powerful networks of political influence. These firms receive long-term government contracts that guarantee revenue streams and shareholder returns. Lobbying efforts, campaign contributions, and close relationships with policymakers ensure that military funding remains a priority regardless of broader fiscal debates. In many regions, defense manufacturing provides employment, further embedding military spending within local economies and making cuts politically difficult. At the same time, underinvestment in social infrastructure creates visible strain within society. Public schools struggle with outdated facilities and limited resources. Healthcare systems face staffing shortages and rising costs. Public transportation deteriorates without adequate maintenance. Social safety nets designed to protect vulnerable populations become thinner over time. While these programs directly affect daily life, they rarely receive the urgency or bipartisan consensus often granted to defense allocations. The opportunity cost of militarization becomes clearer when considering alternative uses of public funds. Investments in renewable energy infrastructure could address climate change while creating long-term employment. Expanded healthcare access could reduce preventable illnesses and increase workforce productivity. Affordable housing initiatives could stabilize communities and reduce homelessness. Education funding could strengthen innovation and social mobility. Each of these areas contributes to national well-being in tangible and measurable ways, yet they often face prolonged political negotiation and budgetary hesitation. Militarization also shapes research and technological priorities. Government-funded research frequently flows into defense-related innovation, from cybersecurity to aerospace engineering. While such advancements can produce civilian applications, the initial orientation remains tied to strategic competition rather than social improvement. Redirecting a portion of these resources toward public health research, sustainable agriculture, or climate resilience could generate widespread societal benefits. The imbalance between military expansion and social spending reflects structural choices about how power and security are defined. When security is understood primarily through military strength, financial commitments naturally follow that logic. When human security, access to healthcare, education, housing, and stable employment, is treated as secondary, funding patterns mirror that hierarchy. Budgetary decisions ultimately reveal collective priorities embedded within political institutions and economic structures. A military strike on Iran by Israel and the United States would carry consequences far beyond a single exchange of missiles or airstrikes. The Middle East is not a collection of isolated states operating independently. It is a deeply interconnected region shaped by alliances, rivalries, proxy networks, and historical grievances. Any direct confrontation involving Iran risks activating a chain reaction of responses that could quickly expand the scale and duration of the conflict. Iran maintains relationships with various non-state actors and allied groups across the region. These connections create multiple fronts through which retaliation could occur, stretching far beyond Iranian territory. Military engagement could draw neighboring countries into the conflict, whether through direct involvement, logistical support, or defensive alignments. What may begin as a targeted operation could evolve into a multi-country confrontation involving airspace violations, missile exchanges, cyber attacks, and disruptions to maritime trade routes. The strategic geography of the region further heightens the danger of escalation. Critical waterways, including shipping corridors essential to global energy supply, are situated within reach of potential military operations. If shipping lanes are threatened or blocked, international powers with economic stakes in those routes may feel compelled to intervene. The involvement of additional global actors would significantly increase the complexity of the conflict and reduce the possibility of swift containment. Escalation is also fueled by the logic of deterrence and retaliation. Once an initial strike occurs, political leadership on all sides faces domestic pressure to respond forcefully. Backing down may be perceived as weakness, particularly in highly charged national environments. Military doctrine often includes calculated responses designed to reassert credibility. However, each calculated response carries the risk of miscalculation. Communication failures, intelligence errors, or unintended civilian casualties can accelerate the pace of confrontation, transforming limited objectives into broader warfare. The humanitarian consequences of regional escalation would be severe. Civilian populations across multiple countries could face displacement, infrastructure damage, and shortages of essential resources. Urban centers, energy facilities, and communication networks are particularly vulnerable in modern warfare. The destruction of infrastructure disrupts access to water, electricity, healthcare, and transportation, compounding the immediate human toll. Refugee flows could increase dramatically, placing additional strain on neighboring countries and international aid systems. Regional instability also creates long-term political consequences. Prolonged conflict can weaken state institutions, empower extremist groups, and destabilize fragile governments. Economic activity declines as investment retreats and tourism collapses. Reconstruction costs burden already strained public finances. Generations may grow up amid insecurity, deepening cycles of resentment and mistrust that make future peace negotiations more difficult. The presence of advanced military technologies adds another layer of unpredictability. Cyber warfare capabilities, drone systems, and precision-guided munitions expand the range and speed of engagement. While these technologies are often described as precise, they can also escalate conflicts rapidly by lowering the threshold for initial strikes. The digital domain introduces vulnerabilities in financial systems, communication infrastructure, and energy grids, extending the battlefield beyond physical borders. In moments of rising tension and geopolitical rivalry, diplomacy is often portrayed as slow, fragile, or ineffective. Military action is described as decisive and strong, while negotiation is framed as compromise or concession. Yet history consistently demonstrates that durable stability is built not through force alone, but through sustained dialogue, mutual recognition, and structured agreements. When confrontation looms between states such as Israel, United States, and Iran, diplomacy offers a pathway that prioritizes long-term security over short-term escalation. Diplomatic engagement does not imply agreement on every issue. It creates formal channels for communication that reduce the risk of miscalculation. In highly militarized environments, misunderstandings can escalate rapidly. A misinterpreted signal, an intelligence error, or a defensive maneuver perceived as offensive can trigger responses that spiral into open conflict. Ongoing diplomatic contact allows governments to clarify intentions, establish red lines, and create mechanisms for de-escalation before tensions reach irreversible levels. Negotiation also addresses the underlying causes of conflict rather than only its symptoms. Security disputes often stem from historical grievances, regional power imbalances, economic sanctions, or ideological rivalry. Military strikes may temporarily weaken capabilities, but they rarely resolve structural tensions. Diplomatic frameworks, by contrast, can incorporate phased agreements, verification systems, and reciprocal commitments that gradually reduce distrust. These arrangements require patience and monitoring, but they build foundations for more predictable relationships. Economic cooperation can serve as a stabilizing force within diplomacy. Trade relationships, investment partnerships, and multilateral development initiatives create shared interests that discourage armed confrontation. When economies become interdependent, the cost of conflict rises for all sides. This economic logic encourages restraint and promotes collaborative problem solving. Joint infrastructure projects, energy coordination, and regional development programs can transform competitive dynamics into mutually beneficial exchanges. International institutions also play a role in facilitating dialogue. Multilateral forums provide neutral spaces for negotiation and mediation. Even when political rhetoric is confrontational, behind-the-scenes diplomacy often continues through diplomatic envoys and back-channel communication. These efforts may not dominate headlines, but they can prevent crises from escalating. Structured dialogue ensures that even adversarial states maintain avenues for peaceful resolution. Public perception influences the success of diplomacy. Leaders must communicate to their citizens that negotiation is not weakness but strategic prudence. In highly polarized environments, this requires reframing strength as the ability to prevent war rather than initiate it. Diplomatic achievements may not produce dramatic images, yet they can prevent devastating consequences that would affect generations. The global challenges facing modern societies further reinforce the need for cooperation. Climate change, economic inequality, public health crises, and technological disruption transcend national borders. Military confrontation diverts financial resources and political attention away from these pressing issues. Diplomatic engagement allows states to allocate energy toward shared solutions instead of destructive competition. Collaboration on environmental agreements, economic stability, and scientific research strengthens international resilience. Choosing diplomacy requires political will, sustained engagement, and recognition of mutual vulnerability. It demands acknowledgement that long-term security emerges from stable relationships rather than cycles of retaliation. While negotiation may be complex and incremental, it remains a pathway capable of preventing escalation and preserving both regional and global stability.